Chapter 4. How many Pauls does it take to change a light bulb? Is contemporary Paul really the original Paul? And was the Paul considered to be the original Paul really a replacement Paul? If your mind's not yet been turned to scrambled eggs, give it till the end of the chapter. While they were crying out, "Beware your flowers and long hair," while you and Sergeant Pepper saw the writing on the wall. Terry Knight, St. Paul. I've joked at many of my public talks that I'm going to introduce a Paul McCartney drinking game, where every time I mention his name, the audience takes a swig of their liquor of choice. By the end of the evening, they'll all be in a hopeless mess on the floor. The quip does illustrate the degree to which the controllers of this individual, whoever he may be, we'll come to that, really are rinsing every last drop of potential out of him, both in terms of income generation and the subtle pushing of ideas helpful to their overall agendas of complete human control. As late as 2025, by which point even the real Paul would have been into his 80s, McCartney was still slogging it out on the international tour circuit. The McCartney legacy, not to mention that of the Beatles, is the gift that keeps on giving for the industry's true handlers. My research suggests that there are different grades when it comes to music's main assets. Some are required to fulfill their role for only a short period, think Jim Morrison, but are then allowed to retire their public personas through faking their deaths, only possible with the full complicity of the military intelligence services which work in cahoots with the entertainment industry. Some are granted the same privilege, but have to put in much longer tenures before earning their release. Think Elvis Presley or David Bowie. Some, it seems, outlive their usefulness and literally become worth more dead than alive, or become publicly outspoken to the point that they become a thorn in the side to the establishment and earn themselves a dispatching of a different nature. Think John Lennon, Bob Marley, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Chris Cornell, Chester Bennington, George Michael, and the jury's still out on Michael Jackson and Prince. Then others, presumably the most valued assets of all, are allotted a different fate, to put in a lifetime of service to the business until they drop. This is the realm of the Sirs. Sir Elton John, Sir Rod Stewart, Sir Tom Jones, Sir Cliff Richard, Sir Mick Jagger, Sir Ringo Starr, and Sir Paul McCartney. When two become one? As many listeners will be aware, through the sterling work of researchers like Mike Williams, Richard Balducci and others, and as documented at great length in Musical Truth Volume 1, a great deal of circumstantial and documentary evidence exists, not to mention cryptic clues which seem to have been deliberately placed in Beatles album sleeves, lyrics, backmasked messages and promotional photos to suggest that the real biological James Paul McCartney was replaced in 1966 by an individual named William Shepherd, known as Billy Shears, and that Shepherd has been playing the public role of Paul McCartney to this day. The full version of the conspiracy has it that the real Paul died in a car crash on 11th of September 1966, 9/11/66, which may or may not have been accidental, depending on who's telling the story. Since Volume 1, I've been contacted by a couple of people claiming they distinctly remember a news bulletin being broadcast at that time stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been involved in a car crash. One remembers the story advising that he had been injured, while the other remembers it as stating that he had died. Both remained on tenterhooks for further bulletins, but none came, which is a strange thing for news of such magnitude. Unless the first bulletin had been unintentionally leaked and a cover-up operation was quickly put in place. It puts me in mind of Jane Stanley on BBC TV News announcing on September 11th, 2001, that World Trade Center Building 7 had collapsed some 20-odd minutes before it actually did, and that bulletin never being repeated, and Stanley promptly disappearing from our TV screens. Additionally, a well-known British record producer told me that he clearly recalls hearing the McCartney news just the once back in 1966. We can assume that no public recordings of any such bulletins are in existence, or they surely would have surfaced by now. Further afield, meanwhile, many viewers of The Monkees TV sitcom on NBC in America have spoken of remembering a newsflash going out during the airing of the debut episode, Royal Flush, on 12th of September 1966, reporting that Beatle Paul McCartney had been involved in a terrible accident. A further update was promised after the show at 11 p.m, but never came. Many viewers have reportedly written sworn testimonies as to what they heard. The phenomenon appears nowhere in the official Beatles record. If really just provable nonsense, why would the band's controllers not have gone public to denounce such absurd claims? I attended an event hosted by the Beatles' official biographer, Mark Lewison, to mark the 50th anniversary of the Abbey Road album in 2019. His presentation gave no mention of the McCartney death rumours which emerged in the wake of the album's launch in '69, so I took the opportunity to ask him why. He scoffed, commenting, "You don't believe that old nonsense, do you?" Again, if nonsense, where's the harm in presenting it as such? Incidentally, the creators of the Monkees show, Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, are said to have been inspired by the antics of the Beatles in their first two films to create an American version of the band. Night Falls. A candidate whose name has cropped up frequently in McCartney research of recent years is Charles Maxwell Knight, OBE, a so-called super spy in the employ of British military intelligence. He's taken as having been an inspiration for M, James Bond's boss in the Ian Fleming stories, as is Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, under whom Fleming had served in naval intelligence during World War II. Knight's biography tells us, perhaps inevitably, that he conducted operations from his flat in Dolphin Square, Pimlico. This location was linked to revelations of a paedophile ring centred around the British corridors of power, and linked to many prominent MPs, including Lord Leon Britton, Margaret Thatcher's Home Secretary. A scoot off down a tangent, if I may be permitted, it would be remiss of me, when mentioning Leon Britton, not to point out that Britton is a bloodline cousin of DJ/producer Mark Ronson, as well as a second cousin once removed of another MP, Sir, naturally, Malcolm Rifkind. Now you know how Ronson shot to fame so rapidly when he did. Joan Miller, a woman recruited by Maxwell as one of his many spies, wrote that, despite his frequent tirades berating homosexuals, he was probably gay himself, and that he was neurotic, anti-Semitic, and obsessed with the occult. Sounds like just the man for the job. Researcher Richard Balducci is convinced that Knight was in fact the man charged with dispatching biological James Paul McCartney in the aftermath of the mythical car crash in 1966, and that he did so by means of a hammer blow to the head. This, Balducci maintains, was the inspiration for the bizarre Maxwell's Silver Hammer track on the Abbey Road album. With its lyric, "Bang, bang, Maxwell's silver hammer came down upon his head." The song's lyrics are credited to Paul McCartney / Billy Shears, take your pick, while the other Beatles are on record as having hated it. The hammer is said to have been of the Bluebird brand, which is thought by some to have been referenced on McCartney's later song, Bluebird. Balducci maintains that there are synchronistic British intelligence clues all over the replacement McCartney's work, most notably on the cover for the Band on the Run album, the third from his group Wings. The cover shows a ragtag group of household names posing as if caught in a searchlight whilst trying to escape. Among them are Christopher Lee, who turns out to be a little more than a mere film actor. Balducci writes, Ian Fleming was inspired to create super spy James Bond 007 after listening to his step-cousin Christopher Lee's clandestine British military intelligence operations adventures. Lee's connections are why he is shown on the Band on the Run cover. Christopher Lee worked with and is here representing Charles Maxwell Knight, the British super spy M, who murdered Beatle James Paul McCartney with Maxwell's silver hammer. James Coburn, who played super spy Derek Flint in the James Bond spoofs, is in the as above so below pose, with his right hand pointing at Band and his left hand linking the surrogate M, Christopher Lee, with the death of the band the Beatles, and why the surviving bandmates are on the run. On the subject of Wings covers, a limited edition collage poster was given away with copies of the London Town album. On it, written across a picture of a bare-chested Paul/Billy posing with Linda, is the word substitute. At first glance it appears to have been written in biro, but on further inspection it turns out to be part of the print. According to some, the Who song Substitute, with its line, I'm a substitute for another guy, I look pretty tall but my heels are high, was about the replacement of McCartney. The line, I can see right through your plastic Mac, follows. Mac equals Macca, McCartney. Whatever the truth of the crash death rumours, there can be no rational denying that there have indeed been at least two individuals playing the role of McCartney through the decades. Critical analysis of photographs and video footage gives us all we need to arrive at that conclusion. If present-day McCartney really is Shepherd, Shears, I wonder if he would have been made aware, all those decades ago, that he would be living out the charade literally until he would draw his last breath, as appears to be the case. Swap shop? In the last book, I offered my theory that the shorter, rounder-faced, slightly chubbier Paul, the left-hander that we see in pre-1966 photographs and footage, and the one with the prominently arched right eyebrow, may well be the replacement. I arrived at this idea after considering much earlier pre-fame pictures of Paul, where he looks distinctly like a younger version of the one we have today. Some have claimed that these early pictures have been digitally manipulated, but some exist in print form as well as online. This idea was expanded upon by a friend, who commented, As a musician, I would personally find it impossible to even attempt to play a guitar left-handed, and bearing in mind how relatively few left-handers there are, it would make it a nightmare to create a replacement. I'm thinking that, logically, Billy was always meant to be a Beatle from the start, but somehow couldn't take up the role at the appointed time, so they put in a stopgap filler until he was ready. So rather than Billy emulating Paul, was it Paul holding the fort for Billy? This, then, would mean that the stopgap Paul was retired off, presumably in 1966 as per Paul is dead law, and sent back into obscurity. The more sinister take, meanwhile, would suggest that he was sacrificed as part of some kind of ritual. It's always been impossible to prove this due to the lack of verifiable evidence. What we do have is a world of symbolic, cryptic clues scattered across record sleeves, photographs and songs. So we are left to decide as to whether these clues constituted part of some dark occult belief system, or whether it was a cynically cultivated hoax devised to send researchers off down the garden path for decades to come. It worked, and to generate maximum income through increased record sales. Brimful of ashes. Another correspondent offered a similar take on the two concurrent Pauls scenario, this one bringing McCartney's long-term girlfriend of the 1960s, the actress Jane Asher, into the picture. I rather like the idea of there having been two of them right from the start and they're being used as interchangeable parts. Why do I say this? Not for any sentimental reasons, but because that would explain a very big question I've always had about how Jane Asher could have been able to do those pics with the new Paul so soon after the crushing blow that the death of the real Paul must have been to her. How could a grief-stricken, broken-hearted young woman do those playful poses like the famous one of them turning to look behind them into the camera? All very explainable as a lark if she had her Paul still very much alive and tucked away somewhere safe for her. This person then speculates as to whether, if this theory is correct, Jane's father, Dr. Richard Asher, could have been offed as a result of his having this knowledge. Dr. Asher was involved in the study of deep sleep hypnosis techniques, and according to many, McCartney, one of them anyway, was being used as a test subject during the time he was lodging at the Asher family home in Wimpole Street, London, W1, which also doubled as Dr. Asher's clinic. Dr. Asher's body was discovered in the basement of the home in April 1969, a short while after Paul had married Linda following the breakup of his relationship with Jane. The official verdict was suicide. What else? Though there are many reasons to suspect foul play. They weren't worried that he would spill the beans about Paul being dead, because that could simply be laughed away, as it has been for years, as just another crazy conspiracy theory. No, they were worried that Dad would reveal that the real Paul was still alive, and that just wouldn't do for these slime buckets. Incidentally, the Ashers, at least Jane and her brother Peter, become interesting candidates for the Dom Waterson ancestral research treatment. Given his findings, with, as is so often the case, all of the interesting links coming from her mother's side, it perhaps becomes clearer to understand why Jane and Paul ended up a couple. The research shows that, through her mother, Margaret Augusta Elliot, Jane is distantly descended from King Henry VII, the lineage passing through the Churchill and Spencer families, as in Winston and Diana. Well, the controllers weren't going to let Paul get paired off with any old riffraff, were they? Plus, there was the tantalising bonus of Dr. Asher's work, which could be put to good use, and seemingly was. And the pertinent ancestral connections don't end there. Dom takes up the mantle. The Ashers, via the Elliot line, are bloodline related, no question, to the ancient Viscount Dillons of Costello Gallen in the county of Mayo, a peerage of Ireland, created in 1622. We can take the family back to Sir Henry de Leon, who married the daughter of Sir John de Courcy. His wife was Afessa de Courcy, daughter of Godred Olafsson, King of the Isles, a member of the Crovan dynasty. Look where the Crovan dynasty ruled, the Scottish area of Kintyre. If I were a betting man, I would say Macca is bloodline related to these ancient royal families, and Asher was some kind of ancient royal match-up that possibly didn't work out. Now, that is what I call matrix coding. What it means, I haven't a fucking clue, but it cannot be brushed off as mere coincidence. Perhaps we should consider, therefore, that if the Paul-Jane relationship didn't work out, Paul, or Billy by this point, was instead paired up with Linda Eastman due to her Epstein family bloodline. And if these relationships were arranged, could the process also have been getting replicated when, in 2024, it was announced that Paul/Billy's grandson, Arthur, son of his eldest daughter, Mary, was dating Phoebe, the daughter of Bill and Melinda Gates, providing an ostensible connection between two families long known for pushing elite agendas helpfully along their way. Further curiosity comes from Jane and Peter's first cousin, Diana, too, who passed away in 2024. Matt Sergiu, another impeccable Beatles researcher, revealed in episode 10 of our Magical Mystery Talk podcast that Diana was credited with having been a co-founder of the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. Despite its worthy-sounding title, this organisation turns out to have morphed from the Process Church of the Final Judgment. I mentioned the Process in Musical Truth Volume 1 as having been an offshoot of Scientology, founded by Mary and Robert McLean, who renamed themselves the Grimston. The Process played a big part in the 1960s counterculture scene in San Francisco, where it counted among its associates Sirhan Sirhan, the Palestinian accused of shooting Senator Robert Kennedy, and ticking all the boxes for having been another MKUltra Manchurian candidate, Charles Manson, and Son of Sam serial killer David Berkowitz. Nice crowd. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon author Dave McGowan had earlier penned a book titled Programmed to Kill, in which he connected the high-profile serial killers of the past several decades back to CIA mind control experimentation. Hard to believe, I know. It was in London that the Process Church began. However, it published a regular magazine, The Process, with Jimmy Savile gracing the cover of one edition, in which he spoke of rising from the darkness and leaping about, causing mayhem left and right, late at night, and Paul McCartney and Jane Asher being interviewed for another. It also broadcast a regular show which Diana Asher hosted. Back to Dr. Richard Asher, who, as well as being a senior physician at the Central Middlesex Hospital, had written a 1956 paper titled Respectable Hypnosis, and was reportedly interested in the study of what happens to the human mind when in deep sleep states. The writer and proprietor of Beacon Films, Redwell Trabant, suggested in a 2014 article that Asher had used McCartney as a test subject in some of his experiments, and that this may explain where one of the Beatles' most famous songs came from. Dr. Asher quit his hospital post suddenly in 1964. Was this to focus more on his mind control experimentation at his home clinic? McCartney has always maintained that he woke up one morning in Wimpole Street with the melody to Yesterday in his head and rushed to his piano to avoid forgetting it. He was, apparently, concerned that he may have plagiarised someone else's work. As he put it at the time, "For about a month I went around to people in the music business and asked them whether they had ever heard it before. Eventually it became like handing something in to the police. I thought if no one else claimed it after a few weeks, then I could have it." In 2006, however, a songwriter and music producer named Lily Greco claimed on an Italian television show that the melody of Yesterday was in fact lifted from a Neapolitan aria named Piacere che viene a dicere, dating back to 1895. Though Greco claimed this situation most likely arose from McCartney's fondness for Neapolitan songs, would a more likely candidate for having an encyclopedic knowledge of world music not be Jane Asher's mother, Margaret Elliott, given her credentials as an honorary member of the Royal Academy of Music, and as a music teacher to, among other students, Sir George Martin? Here a tantalising possibility emerges. Supposing the Ashers were working together on Richard's hypnosis experiments, possibly as a British variant on the CIA's MKUltra. If Richard had wanted to test whether a piece of music could be subliminally implanted into a subject's mind as they slept, might Margaret not have suggested using a composition with which, as a student of world music, she would have been familiar? And would Paul not have been the ideal guinea pig, given that he was already a household name pop star and, conveniently, was sleeping right under the Asher's roof? Equally intriguingly, how about this to truly put the mind into the mincer? Following Paul's solo performance of Yesterday on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1965, Lennon came off the back of it with the comment, "Thank you, Paul. That was just like him." This was the year before, according to PID law, the real Paul died and was replaced. It's a very small world when it comes to the Ashers and the Beatles, it seems. Jane's boyfriend, Paul, was of course managed by Brian Epstein, who had a business partner named Nicky Byrne, who handled the American side of the Beatles' merchandising, Saltaeb. Listen to Chapter 9 for more. One of the partners in this venture was Lord Peregrine Eliot, not only a descendant of the celebrated T.S. Eliot, but, you can see where I'm going with this, can't you? A relative of Margaret Asher, née Eliot. Things didn't end happily for Richard and Margaret's marriage, however, when Richard went missing for several days in 1969. Reportedly, the family searched the house high and low, but he was nowhere to be found. Then they discovered him dead in the basement, where, presumably, they didn't think to look before, on the 2nd of May. The very basement where Paul had reportedly composed a handful of the Beatles' most celebrated songs. Verdict? Suicide. I bet you saw that one coming. He was 57. The Express newspaper reported that 2 bottles were found near his body, but didn't say what they may have contained. 1st of May is May Day or Beltane in the ancient pagan calendar, and this time of year was, and still is, associated with human sacrifice. Just saying. Paul had quit dating Jane the previous year when, according to reports, she had caught him in bed with Linda Eastman. Paul and Linda got married on the 12th of March 1969, 6 weeks before Dr. Asher's suicide. Had he outlived his usefulness, his work having been completed? Was he considered a liability, considering he must have had knowledge of there being 2 Pauls, with Jane having stepped out with both of them? Could part of his work have involved programming a replacement Paul? If his death was to silence him, it certainly prevented Jane and her brother Peter from speaking out about anything they may have known. While Peter has remained in the music industry, as one half of the group Peter and Gordon, for whom McCartney is credited with having written their hit song A World Without Love, Jane has written novels and baked cakes. Dr. Asher's suicide occurred during an unfortunate spate of deaths within Beatles circles. Brian Epstein had accidentally overdosed in August 1967, aged just 32. He had gone to great lengths to conceal his homosexuality at a time when this was still a criminal offence in Britain. Homosexuality was finally legalised on the 27th of July, 1 month before Brian died. Brian's lawyer, David Jacobs, died of suicide less than a year later. Then, in July 1970, it was the turn of the paediatric psychiatrist Dr. Emmanuel Miller to get tired of living. Miller had worked with Richard Asher, according to unsubstantiated claims, on Tavistock-sponsored mind control research, and was the father of political satirist Sir Jonathan Miller, CBE. Jonathan studied medicine at Cambridge University under Richard Asher. In 1966, he directed a TV adaptation of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, a known trigger in MKUltra-style programming. Jane had earlier starred as a child actress in a presentation of Alice, and in 1985 played Alice's mother in the film Dream Child, directed by Dennis Potter and Gavin Miller. Do you want to know a secret? When discussing on a TV chat show the writing of the track How Do You Sleep, acknowledged as a swipe against McCartney at a time when the relationship between the pair was at an all-time low, John Lennon was asked if Paul was his best friend, to which he replied, "He was. I don't know about now." Speculation can be applied to such comments and interpreted as veiled clues by those who wish to find them. Accusations of confirmation bias will come from those who do not wish to acknowledge a replacement. The truth of the matter is that anyone who wasn't personally involved in the Beatles' inner circle cannot know for sure whether the real Paul died. We can theorise all we want, but verifiable evidence is thin on the ground, and possible cryptic clues are all we're left to work with. Again, what we can know, simply from using our eyes, is that at least 2 different men have been publicly presented as Paul McCartney. We start from there.